So because this is a webinar about storytelling, it seems appropriate that I start with my own story. Like most people, my captivation with storytelling started when I was a little girl. And one of my very earliest memories is of my dad reading stories such as Peck's Bad Boy to me and my sister before bedtime. And here's a picture of him and my mom on their wedding day and me and my sister. And I love books so much that through my imagination, I would transform my backyard into Laura Ingalls Wilder's prairie home and solve mysteries like the Boxcar Children from my treehouse. And I wrote poetry, really bad poetry, and I journaled just about every week up until I was a young adult. So as an adult, writing played a huge part in my education and career, first as a grad student studying public policy, and then as a technical writer in corporate America. When I was 26 years old, I had my first publication, and it was then that I finally felt like I had really learned the craft of writing. Years later, when I stepped out of the workforce to raise my kids, I kind of lost that sense of being and who I was. Writing was how I communicated. And when I no longer had that outlet, I kind of felt like a rudderless sailboat, drifting toward the shore with no way to reverse that forward thrust of moving with the tide and the wind. But one day when my son was just a few months old, things kind of changed. That day probably started out as usual back at that time. Me in my sweatpants, covered in baby spit up for the third straight day in a row, my hair hastily thrown into a messy ponytail, and me well into my second or third cup of coffee. And I walked out to the mailbox and I found a brochure for an online writing program with the Institute for Children's Literature. And it advertised a program in which published writers would instruct students in the fundamental elements of creating a story that would appeal to children and teenagers, such as plot, character development, conflict resolution, sensory appeal, and just kind of like all the nuts and bolts it took to get published. And I never envisioned myself as an author of children's books, but I loved literature, so I thought, well, why not? So because my son was just a baby at the time, this is how I thought my typical day would go. Typing away on my computer for at least 2 to 3 straight hours at a time of non-interrupted writing nirvana. And all that time, my son sleeping peacefully in his crib, and in my mind, I was already writing my acceptance speech for the John Newbery Award, which is given to an author with the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. Okay, so this is what really happened. Like all babies, my son completely had plans of his own and decided to be that baby that never ever slept. And my dad, being the very wise man that he is, quipped, "Meredith, he never read all those child rearing books to know how he is supposed to behave, so what do you expect?" So what should have been actually a 9-month course in writing children's literature actually took me 2 years to complete. But needless to say, I never won that Newbery Award, but I have had success in getting articles that I have written covered by the press, as well as helping others get their own op-eds or opinion editorials published. And the result of all that media coverage contributes to an overall movement, granted at a glacial speed at times, to create a positive change in our communities. I do use many of those lessons learned from that course, such as how, creating that hook and how to engage your reader and win them over, which is what leads me here today, talking to you about storytelling and media advocacy. So let's talk about exactly what is media advocacy. Possibly some of you may have taken IPS's intro webinar that we offered back in December, The Art of Media Advocacy, and how organizations can use news media to inform communities, policies, and decision makers. And this webinar that you're at today kind of takes a deeper dive into effective ways to use personal narrative to advance your organization's goals and getting your messaging across in a way that readers can relate to. So let's review the definition of media advocacy exactly. It's the strategic use of media that benefit public health and safety. It's used in media that we think of as being traditional media, such as television, radio, and newspapers, but it also includes social media, blogs, podcasts, public service announcements, videos, and infographics. And all these help shape the news and are used to advocate for causes that we care about and influence policymaking. It is important to know that media advocacy is not just about educating the public about concerns that are out there. It's more holistic than that. It's designed to actually engage your stakeholders, whether they are policymakers, community members, school administrators, parents, students, law enforcement, whomever, into actually being a champion of your cause and not just a consumer of the news. One advantage of news coverage, especially at the grassroots level, is that it puts pressure on policymakers to implement specific solutions to public health problems. And it also raises the issue into the local or the national conversation. And the Journal of Public Health Policy defines media advocacy as a strategy that shifts the focus from the personal to the social, from the individual to the political, and from the behavior or practice to the policy or environment. And if you aren't familiar enough with our agency, this is where IPS focuses our work on upstream prevention, looking at the systems and policies that create conditions that lead to inequities in health, which can then lead to things like substance use disorders and adverse childhood experiences, and then using the media to amplify that message. So a good way to frame the message is to use the message triangle. And it's a very simple tool that consists of describing the problem, what the data says about the problem, and offering up a solution. I use it to help me keep my message laser focused when I'm writing a piece to submit to the press. And it helps me determine what I want to say and how to write it. What's great about it is that storytelling can be used in all three of these elements. For instance, perhaps someone describes the problem through a lived experience, or a photograph accompanies an article that allows a reader to visualize what they are seeing going on in their community. And it answers the question, why are you here? The data about the problem should be explained in a way that readers can understand. And we'll look at an example of this in a minute. The data is the answer to the question, how is this a problem? And then there's the solution, or that conflict resolution that I spoke about in storytelling. In all of our stories, our main character undergoes some type of transformation. And the same can be said when we're talking about the type of transformation in our communities that we hope to achieve through media advocacy. It always answers the question, what can solve the problem? And just a little side note, as Brittany mentioned, this tool will be sent out with other materials after this webinar. So let's talk more specifically about storytelling. A story is a journey that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a narration of real or fictitious events that are meant to entertain, interest, and educate us. And it has characters. It has a hero and it has a villain. And it has a plot. And the plot is the culmination of the hero's journey and ultimate transformation. And it usually has a climax, which marks the turning point in her story. In other words, the difference between where she is at the beginning of the story and where she ends up at the end. And each story can generally fall into one of these 7 universal story plots. And the slide that I have up on the screen provides examples of ways that you, the writer, can narrate your organization's or community's story. So the first one, overcoming a monster. So in this plot, the character succeeds despite the odds being stacked against them. So think of Aaron Brockovich versus Pacific Gas and Electric in California. And the story explores the life lessons met along the way and concludes with a message of becoming stronger through adversity. The second one, Rags to Riches, can be used to demonstrate how your protagonists earn their present day success. In media advocacy, it can be used, for example, to describe how a community came together to clean up all of its graffiti, only to later become recognized by the city for its beautification efforts. In Voyage and Return, we all love those stories about our hometown heroes returning to their place of origin to better the community that helps shape the person that they've become. And through their stories, they take us on their journey, sharing with us what they learned along the way and how they will apply those experiences to whatever cause they're now championing. So an example of this that I recently came across was in a news release about the County of San Diego's new director of the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. And the article describes his experience from being a Navy corpsman to becoming chief of staff of the chief administrative office. The article goes on to talk about how his experience working with the community and county leaders in developing and implementing strategies that address inequities in San Diego's most underserved communities has prepared him for this position. So number 4, the quest. You commonly see the quest plot line in stories of people with lived experiences, which is an accounting of the experiences and choices a person makes and the knowledge that they gain. And the purpose is to show how the main character grows emotionally to be able to succeed. So an example of this was a recent interview that Ben Affleck, the award-winning actor and producer, gave to Diane Sawyer with ABC News about his struggles with addiction. And if you watch this segment, it's not just a question and answer interview. It's a story in which Affleck, the protagonist, identifies the villain as drugs, alcohol, gambling, anything to make him feel better. And his conflict, how a number of things brought about his downfall, untreated depression, marital trouble, family history of addiction, even his own vulnerabilities. And he finally comes around to discussing his transformation, how a relapse that was publicly broadcast for the whole world to see, and about how being a father taught him the importance of being sober during his children's formative years, unlike his own upbringing. And he ends the interview with a very simple but profound statement: what is possible is greater than the past. And I thought that was actually a really good media bite. So Diane Sawyer is a seasoned professional, but she did use some very basic storytelling elements throughout this segment that can easily be translatable to grassroots advocacy efforts. And all she had to do was capture our attention from the very beginning with a compelling, relatable story. So moving on to comedy. This is surprising. Media advocacy doesn't have to be all serious. And an article on laughtereffect.com describes really well how we actually can use comedy to our advantage. And as it turns out, Aristotle and Freud both commented on comedy's utility as a source of social critique and a way to challenge us to see things differently. To tell a joke is to kind of bend the construct of reality and to open up the possibilities of seeing something from a different angle. The author of that article on laughtereffect.com goes on to say that advocating for social justice actively challenges the status quo in order to level the playing field. Social justice requires and demands that we engage and empathize and connect, and often that we see differently. So, and today we have comedy television shows like Blackish and Rami take on issues of what it's like to live in our society as a person of color. And shows like these take on tough topics, racial, religious, cultural, and socioeconomic issues, and put them in a format that we can appreciate, comedy. There's also stand-up comedy shows like the Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj that pushes the envelope on bringing laughter from the audience while tackling racism, xenophobia, sexism, and every other type of social injustice. And I think what makes these successful is that, and if you think about it, we would rather spend our time being entertained than educated, but it doesn't have to be an either or, it can be both. So in tragedy, there is no doubt that there's a lot of tragedy in social justice issues. Think of the millions of people who have died from COVID, the families and communities that have been destroyed by the opioid epidemic, and the hundreds of children separated from their parents at the border. In this tragedy plot line, a well-crafted media advocacy story would have the principal character give a first-person account in order to explain a wider problem to society. By giving that first-person perspective, they can really dig down into the emotion of the story. And one way to use the tragedy plot line is to demonstrate how not to do things and to learn from our mistakes. So in media advocacy, one example I can think of is when we have reported on the overconcentration of liquor stores in a community. And research shows that as alcohol density increases, then underage drinking also goes up. So that made me think, but now with more and more states legalizing cannabis and a wide market opening up to communities, what will happen to youth cannabis use as dispensaries, for instance, move into neighborhoods? And we've used the voices of youth to highlight that as a legitimate concern that they do have. So finally, in Rebirth, for this plotline example, I'm going to go straight to one of IPS's greatest examples of community work and transformation. And for those on this webinar outside of San Diego and not familiar with our county, Casa de Oro is a neighborhood in East San Diego County that had once been riddled with a range of community problems such as public intoxication, marijuana and other drug use, drug sales, and underage drinking, and illegal dispensaries. So Casa de Oro had once been a source of pride for residences and businesses, but over the years, many felt that it had just become a dumping ground for many undesirable businesses. Using IPS's expertise in community organizing and media advocacy, an alliance of community members and businesses came together and formed to address these issues. And today is actually truly living up to its name, which translates into House of Gold. So in all of these examples, there is a character who runs into an obstacle that is eventually resolved by the end of his journey. And to help us understand kind of the purpose of storytelling, we can look no further than Pixar Studios' Oscar-winning writer of such films like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and A Bug's Life, Andrew Stanton. And Stanton describes storytelling as knowing that everything you're saying from the first sentence to the last is leading to a singular goal. And in getting to that goal, Stanton asserts that the greatest story commandment is to make me care. So let me repeat that. Make me care. Make me want to understand more about the challenges your community faces. Make me feel invested in ensuring that people have an equal opportunity to live the kind of life we all imagine. And our main character is perhaps someone we all know and gives us a reason to care, or perhaps they are just the mouthpiece for describing struggles that we may personally experience in our own lives. So when you're writing, you want to hook the audience right from the very start. Simply not reading any further is the easiest decision a person can make. And one way to keep your reader engaged is to stir up their emotions, whether it's happiness, enthusiasm, grief, anger, frustration. Stories help transmit emotions, which are very powerful in getting people to act or behave in a certain way, preferably in a positive way. Consider the leading sentence of this editorial that came across in the San Diego Union Tribune. It's been nearly 40 years since American civil rights leader Benjamin Chavez coined the term environmental racism to address the fact that so many poor communities populated mostly with people of color had to deal with extreme pollution from neighboring industrial plants, toxic landfills, and other dangerous circumstances. Locally, Barrio Logan residents have long contended with this. So this sentence, this is the very first sentence of this editorial, and it really puts a face on the ones impacted by the problem, the Barrio Logan residents, and stirs up my empathy towards them right away. Right off the bat, the editors identified Barrio Logan as the protagonist of the story. So what if, on the other hand, they had started their article with the following? On average, people of color comprise 56% of the population living in neighborhoods with toxic release inventory facilities compared to 30% elsewhere. It is absolutely an interesting statistic, but it doesn't pull me into the article to make me want to read further. to make me want to care. It doesn't put a face on the issue. Those Barrio Logan residents who are breathing in polluted air and perhaps dealing with more health issues because they live in a part of San Diego that differs dramatically from where I live. So I'm going to add one more practical story commandment that all successful writers follow, which is show, don't tell. This is the commandment that you will hear everywhere in every writing workshop you ever attend. This basically means that the writer uses sensory details and action to guide the reader through the story as opposed to exposition or just words. And the purpose of this is, again, to draw that reader into the setting or the action occurring in the story. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is part of an op-ed written by one of our interns and published in the San Diego Union Tribune. And just for the record, I finessed some of the words to describe the concept of show, don't tell. So in the op-ed, the writer describes an instance where a fellow student had a medical emergency due to alcohol poisoning and was transported to the hospital by ambulance. So she could have said, "We stood in shock as the ambulance carted our fellow dorm mate to the hospital." So let's look at how the writer actually shows rather than tells that. The silence was nearly palpable, cutting short any laughter or conversation in the vicinity. It was like we had been sucked into a vacuum, completely devoid of all sound, thought, and emotion. But it didn't last. The sobering effect of the moment only lasted until the wail of the ambulance stunned us back to reality. The next day, it was as if nothing had really happened at all. She uses a metaphor by describing the experience as like being in a vacuum, the double meaning of using the word sobering in her narrative, describing the wail of the ambulance to shock them back to reality. And the contrast of what was going on at the beginning of the story, the heaviness of the circumstances, to the banality of the next day. A good writer will make use of those sensory details so that the reader is immediately transported into the middle of the story rather than a casual observer of the action. And rather than saying the students were shocked by the event that occurred, the writer describes how they experienced that shock. So on this slide here, why incorporate storytelling into media advocacy? Any advocacy campaign needs its champions, from the grassroots organizers who are the boots on the ground and most connected to the people in the community they serve, to those grass tops decision makers who form the policies and procedures and practices that directly impact these communities. And storytelling is a good way to win over the hearts of the audience. As I discussed before, it brings that reader into the narrative that you're describing, and by captivating, inspiring, and motivating a person to act. And through storytelling, you can change minds and convince people to kind of come over to your way of thinking. And it gets results by persuading others to act in a way that helps you, your organization, achieve your goals. So here's some more food for thought. Did you know that there are over 1,200 daily newspapers and over 1,700 commercial television stations in the US? There are 11 social media platforms with over 200 million users. There are about 1.7 million podcasts and over 600 million blogs worldwide today. In other words, there's no shortage of places where people can go to get their news. So this is another reason to incorporate storytelling into your media advocacy, to stand apart in a very saturated crowd. So if what I have said so far isn't enough to convince you about the power behind storytelling, let me kind of explain the science behind it. According to psychologist Lonnie Peterson, there are chemical elements at play in our brain when we hear a story. And scientists discovered that stories cause the brain to release cortisol, dopamine, and oxytocin when we are told a story. Cortisol aids in making the memory stick when we're trying to make a point. Dopamine, which helps regulate our emotional responses, keeps us engaged, and oxytocin is associated with empathy, which is an important component to building, deepening, and maintaining good relationships. In addition, Princeton neuroscientist Yuri Hassan writes that a story is the only way to activate parts in the brain so that a listener turns the story into their own idea and experience. So through that neurological process that he describes, we live vicariously through the main character without having to actually experience it in our own realities. And this lends itself to empathy, the ability to actually feel the emotions of someone else. And through empathy, we see the world through a different lens, which makes us challenge our own understanding of it and thus facilitating the exchange of ideas. So up till now, we've covered the what and the why of storytelling. Let's now look at kind of the how. So I love this quote by Brené Brown. When we deny our stories, they define us. When we own our stories, we get to write a brave new ending. And there are many ways to talk about the how of writing a story to advance change, but this is the one that resonates the most with me. In this quote, Brené is telling us to be honest with our stories, no matter how difficult or hurtful they may be, to stand firm in our truths. There's no sugarcoating it. Making a change requires a firm acknowledgement of past struggles and pain. In the past year, we've seen more conversations around racial injustice and its historical context, and it has made me re-examine my own truths and has brought me to a place of reckoning with my own upbringing. And growing up in Georgia, I was well aware of racial undertones. My sister and I went to the Black Catholic church school. When I was 11, we moved to the white part of town. And I thought I was more sensitive to the feelings of my Black neighbors and classmates, having grown up with neighborhood kids in which I was the only white one and going to a church that was in a mixed neighborhood. When I was in college, I moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and it's a city that I love for its coastal environment, the amazing food, and Southern hospitality. And she's a survivor. She's endured war and devastating fires and earthquakes and hurricanes. But it's also a city steeped in past and present racism, whose economy thrived because of slavery during the 18th and 19th centuries. And at the time, I loved its history, but I was seeing it through the eyes of someone whose white skin may have been in the minority growing up, but who had never been disenfranchised because of it. So back then, to earn a little extra spending money while I was in college, I worked as a tour guide at the historical city market, which even back in the 19th century was similar to what you would find at today's farmers markets. Fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, those beautiful sweetgrass baskets that the market is known for. And I stood there in my Scarlett O'Hara inspired antebellum hoop skirt costume and wide brim hat. I directed tourists to Charleston's more famous landmarks, such as the beautiful gardens and plantations on the outskirts of town and Fort Sumter, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. In thinking back, I rarely had to direct them to the historic slave market down the street. The reason being, it was such a stain on the city's history, and it wasn't promoted in quite the same way as the other landmarks were. And maybe it just didn't cross the mind of the tourists, who were mostly white, visiting and wanting to experience all the good things that the South had to offer. And whether that was by design of the tourism industry or an effort by society in general to ignore the pains of the past, I don't know. But what I do know now was that I was completely ignorant of the message that me, a white woman wearing such a costume, was sending to the descendants of slaves whose paths I may have crossed during that time. I haven't been back to Charleston in a while, and I can't say where it stands today on acknowledging at best and celebrating at worst the antebellum heyday of plantations, slavery, and Black oppression. So much of today's culture and economy in that city is based on preserving its history. But I've already witnessed some backlash, actually, in the media from this type of memorializing. It's been splashed all over the news. And because of what has happened over the past year, I have a new understanding of where I have been and where I am going as an advocate of equity and social justice. I apologize, that's my dog scratching at the door. The joys of working from home. So believe it or not, people aren't the only ones with good stories. You can find some really good narratives and data through social math. and is the practice of translating statistics and other data so that they become interesting to the journalist, meaningful to the audience, and helpful in advancing public policy. So let's look at the next slide. 78 million acres of rainforest are lost every year. That's a pretty staggering statistic. But let's see how it could also be reworded. Every second, a slice of rainforest the size of a football field is mowed down. That's over 31 million football fields of rainforest each year. I could absolutely comprehend the size of loss when compared to the size of a football field, much less 31 million football fields. After all, I am from the South, and we, the 3S, we live by 3S, faith, family, and football. In the next slide, Brittany is going to show a video that uses social math to inform, entertain, and inspire the viewers. This came about from the San Diego App Challenge, in which we wanted to get people to participate in a contest to create an app that promotes a sober or moderate drinking style. And this was created by a colleague of mine who did such a great job of incorporating social math. So go ahead, Brittany. So again, in that video, she engages the audience into understanding like how much money that can be put into, like, for instance, like I would love to have a weekend or a week away in Maui. So she puts it into a perspective that we can all understand and appreciate. And as another just kind of point to mention is that news reporters and journalists, they like to see these types of like videos or infographics. We try to include these as much as we can in any news releases that we send out, some graphics to give a visualization to the audience. So keeping your narrative focused so that it doesn't go off onto tangents isn't as hard as you think if you just simply follow these guidelines I'm about to outline to you. So the first is to start with a goal. And the goal of the story might be to inspire people to change their behavior or to become a champion of your cause, or it may be to just start the conversation. Whatever it is, it's always good to start with that goal. What do you want to achieve as you begin to develop your story? Because there may be lots of twists and turns, stumbling blocks, and detours that can derail your story along the way. But having that end game will keep you focused. Next, media advocacy doesn't have the same breadth of character development as, say, a novel does. Therefore, it's best to find that one character in your story that you can really focus on. And Lauren Sapella is a writer and a writing coach and said, think of your character as a jewel that has about 1,000 different facets. If you keep turning them over and exploring new sides, you'll keep discovering new information about their personality and motivations. Supporting characters are fine to include, but they should not anchor the story. They are designed to be a part of the main character's backstory or journey. And also to stay focused is be careful not to go off on tangents or down a rabbit hole when writing your story. Stories are kind of like, trees that start with a large trunk, and then you've got branches shooting off the trunk, and then off of the branches you've got twigs shooting this way and that, and you can very easily get lost and end up nowhere if you steer too far off course. And this can easily happen in interviews with news reporters. You have your talking points, and yet you may find yourself ad-libbing or embellishing little details about a story. And before you know it, you're asking yourself, now where was I? So along with that message triangle tool that I presented earlier in the presentation, we'll also be sending out this tool to everybody about the webinar. And this is just a simple worksheet to help you incorporate storytelling into your own media advocacy efforts. So again, starting with the goal, what's the purpose of writing the piece? Think about the hook. What will engage the audience to read that first sentence, but then keep reading on all the way to the very end? Don't forget the basics. Basic journalism is the who, what, when, where, and why. Don't forget those. The details, remember, show, don't tell. Use sensory details. Describe something, how it feels to the touch, how it sounds, how it tastes. Sensory details are very key in livening up your story. And then the key takeaway. What's the most important point of the article that you want to make? And then that call to action, if there is one. Encourage readers to learn from the lessons in the story and prompt action. What is it that you want them to do after they have done reading that article? Next slide, please. So in closing, I started to think about storytelling in general and what I wanted to say, and went right to the source for some good advice, which is my dad. And he's a retired Episcopal priest and has delivered a ton of sermons. And they always kind of follow the same general formula. You start out with a story that the congregation can relate to, something that will capture their attention right away. And it could be something from like the news recently, or something in pop culture or something, and then give it that biblical context, and then kind of like what you expect them to do with those lessons as they carry it out into the world. And my dad said that if you can keep them entertained from the very start, then you have a good chance at holding their attention to the very end. So entertainment may not be something that we normally associate with the important work that we do. But in this world of nonstop news cycles and all the different ways that people can access the news, there's definitely something to be said about using storytelling to capture and hold the audience's attention. So that concludes the presentation part. I think Brittany has some information she wants to share, and then we can take do some question and answers.
Thank you, Meredith. That was wonderful. Let me just load this next slide. I'm sorry.
You're good.
Prezi and Zoom are not as compatible as we hope sometimes. So on this slide, and if you have any questions for Meredith, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we will get to that in just a second. On this slide, you'll see a QR code, and I'll also drop the link into the chat. But if you can take our survey on this webinar, we'd really appreciate it. It helps us plan for future webinars, and we just would really love to hear your feedback. So you can scan this QR code with your phone camera, or I will post the link to the survey in just one moment. And I also just want to say that IPS provides technical assistance and training in all of our core competencies. So if you or your organization or your coalition are interested in receiving that hands-on training or technical assistance, feel free to reach out to us. You can email us at info@publicstrategies.org, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. And for any questions that we don't get to today, we'll post them on our Facebook page by Friday, and you can find us at Vibrant, Healthy, Safe Communities on Facebook. So with that being said, and I'm sorry that I thought I changed it out. I apologize. The QR code, someone's telling me it leads to our old survey, and I really apologize about that. So I'll post the link in just a second. Thank you, Alexander, for pointing that out. I'm very sorry. So Meredith, first question for you. If I don't feel like I have a good story to tell, where can I find them?
So good stories are, they're everywhere, believe it or not. If you feel like your story isn't good, then think about the people that you work with in your organization and their network. And so, for instance, for me, I'm not the one that interfaces the most with our community members. We have community organizers and prevention specialists that do that. And so if I have an idea for an article, I'll reach out to them and say, hey, can someone hook me up with a community member that has, such and such expertise or such and such lived experience. But absent that, then other good places to go are TED Talks. TED Talks are great. I love TED Talks, and there's so many fascinating stories on there. But I also, back when I was taking that children's literature class, I used to actually carry around a notebook, and I would see something and I would just kind of jot down an idea, a general idea of something, just to kind of start to collect those ideas. So that's where I would start, is just looking around you. They're everywhere.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meredith. Is it ever okay to tell a white lie in a story?
So I'm going to err on the side of being conservative. There's embellishing details, and then there's flat out lies. I feel like media, press has suffering a credibility problem at the moment. Fake news, kind of like the buzzword out there. Be very diligent in your truth and what you want to say. The last thing you would want is for someone to come back and to poke holes into your story and prove you wrong, and then you've completely that defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do in the first place, which is get your messaging out there. If it's a little embellishment of a story that doesn't impact the final outcome, some people say that's fine. Lots of storytellers do. I feel like in our world of media advocacy, in which we are trying to promote change, positive change, I say stick as close to the truth as much as possible.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions about how do we weave in our funders' approved messaging. So we all know a lot of our programs are either county, state, or federally funded. So how do we weave in those approved messaging that they want us to get in there?
That's a good question. In my case, I always have we have guidelines that the county has approved. And so in my network of media advocates that I facilitate, we all make sure that we are hitting the mark with, and somehow incorporating those messages into our media pieces. So they're kind of I don't want to say, sometimes it feels like we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, or however that goes, but we already have kind of our basic messaging that we work from, and making sure that our media pieces hit the mark. So if and honestly, sometimes I even have to go back and refer back to what that messaging is, just to make sure that I am hitting the mark on that one. Not knowing, exactly what your relationship is, and how, with your account, with your funder and everything, it's hard to really say, but that's how I do it.
Thank you. Let's see here. So when talking about the villain, especially when it comes to working in public health, how do you go about that? What's the best way to identify and talk about the villain?
So the villain is the it's whatever that obstacle is in preventing your community from being its healthiest version of itself. So the villain can be not necessarily like what we think of a villain in like the movies. I mean, it's an obstacle. So we had this conversation, I remember a couple of years ago, in which we were within our alcohol and other drug work that we do, who's the villain? And we had to be very careful in that we don't isolate the villain or dissuade them from wanting to work with us. We had to be very careful. Like, so let me just give you an example. So bars and restaurants and everything. So we do a lot of work around alcohol, preventing alcohol related harms. Well, bars and restaurants are not the villain. They are businesses, and we want to, and businesses are a healthy, thriving part of any community. And so we are very careful that we don't depict them as a villain, because we need to work with them in our communities. So you do have to kind of, walk a fine line. It's a villain in media advocacy isn't quite so black and white. Let me put it that way. There are some gray areas, and I'm someone who definitely lives in a gray area. I'm not black and white.
Thank you. So we have somebody in the audience who's new to their position, and they run the social media accounts for a nonprofit, but writing seems to be the biggest issue for them. So they're wondering, as far as if you have any advice when they can't find the words or inspiration that they need.
Yes, I do. As I was like preparing for this webinar, I was coming up with lots of words for anything that did not relate to like my own story that I said. And I would literally go online, and for instance, I would put in show, don't tell. And I would look at what other people had written about it. And I just put it together in my own thoughts and words. And it's surprising, like, like show, don't tell. I Googled that, and I know what it is, but how to put that in words, that's a struggle for me. And I struggle like that all the time. And whenever I'm writing, and I look at there's certain like authors that I like, that I read from, and I look and see like how they may phrase something, or publications that I like to read. So for instance, The Skim, it's a really nice newsletter, but their way of they report on like anything from like the pop culture to international news that's making the headlines. And they have a really brilliant way of writing. It's they're punny. But they report on important things. And that's kind of a model that I like to follow as much as I can. It doesn't always happen in media advocacy for the work that I do, but it's casual. It's a casual conversation. So know who your audience is, and know, like, are they going to be more receptive to more formal ways of writing, or kind of more casual way of writing. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And so on the topic of, sorry, my mind just blank. So how do you do a story that's translatable to all cultures? So on the topic of audience and picking your audience, is there a way to make your story in media advocacy translatable across cultures?
There is a lot of interest that I'm seeing on this topic, and writing to different populations and different demographics. And For instance, what may work with, say, like a English speaking audience may not resonate the same way as, like, say, a Filipino audience. And I mentioned that one because that was just the most recent article that I had read. There's definitely cultural sensitivities that need to be taken into account in media advocacy. Bar none. I mean, absolutely. You have to take those into consideration. Words matter. Absolutely. Words matter. And the last thing that you want to do is to put something, a term or a phrase in your media advocacy that could be, that you may not realize, but could be perceived as being culturally insensitive. And like, we've had conversations about this in our staff, like with our staff, like, the best way to approach a certain topic, and we wordsmith to death. I mean, that's what we do. We wordsmith, but we have to take into consideration cultural sensitivities, or else your media piece could just fall flat or not get picked up at all by the audience that you'd want to read it.
So speaking about, targeting different audiences, specifically when trying to target the minorities, and this gets a little bit specific, so hopefully you'll be able to answer this one, but based on your experience, what's the best way to target certain populations or minority groups to get vaccinated, for instance, for COVID-19?
So I would first look at the media that services or that would appeal to those populations. And so I'm going to just speaking as an example of the Latino population. For instance, we're doing a lot of work with the Latino population in San Diego, South Bay. And so one of the media advocacy efforts we have is exactly on this, is talking to them about the importance of getting vaccinated. It's not going to make a bit of difference if Meredith Gibson goes into a Latino community and says, you really need to get vaccinated. We are working with some health promoters or promotores. They are the ones that the Latino population, they trust them. They are the ones that, speak their language, have know all the nuances of their culture and everything. And so they are a trusted partner. They sort of are kind of a bridge, between the Latino population and the work, the media advocacy work that I'm doing. They are an extremely important bridge. And again, going back to find if you can partner with someone who is trusted in that community to help deliver the message, I think is definitely well worth the investment.
Awesome. So for those of us who take a lot of time to write, such as myself, what happens when during your writing cycle an unexpected story emerges in the course of your storytelling? Do you pivot, or do you keep to your original, what you're originally going for? I
pivot. I can tell you right now, I pitched stories, and I'll be honest, you don't always get picked up, but I don't, that doesn't stop me from trying. But you take into what happened a year ago. I had my media plan, and it was all about, health around alcohol and cancer. And then, lo and behold, March 13th came along, and we're in a pandemic. Completely had to pivot and talk more about alcohol in the context of COVID. And it worked, because news reporters, they are always looking for a new angle to cover different topics. I mean, one topic doesn't mean that it's just one dimensional. It's very multidimensional. And so you pivot, but you table that original topic and then come back to it at a time when maybe more appropriate. So, and that's what I'm doing. I've done my COVID stuff, and now I'm revisiting news releases or topics that I kind of shelved this time last year.
Awesome. Thank you. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to drop them in. We do have some great feedback in the question and answer, Meredith. Some people are saying this webinar has completely changed their life and they can't wait to get these tools, and they truly appreciate you speaking today and providing this information to help elevate their work. So thank you, Meredith. Doesn't look like we have any more questions, so we'll go ahead and end this webinar. And thank you so much again, Meredith. For all of you attendees, you will get the links to the presentation deck, as well as the tools, and then a link to the correct survey. And again, I apologize for the QR code not working. Technology.
It's okay, I understand. I have a dog back here who's barking, so not exactly part of the webinar either.
Yeah. And we did have one final question, Meredith. Since we do have a couple minutes, I will pose it. Is it okay to quote a public official who spoke at a news conference without first getting their permission to use the quote?
Short answer, yes. As long as you say where it was mentioned, or, you know, at a press conference on such and such date, so-and-so, you know, quote said this. So yes, quote the original, you know, place and time if you can.
Perfect. Thank you, Meredith. And thank you everybody for joining us. And if you would like, you can sign up for our newsletter. And I will put that in the chat, and that will keep you in the loop of all future webinars for IPS and also sign you up for our newsletter. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.